So, just like everything else in my life, my practice changes over time. Sometimes it feels really strong and really engaged, and I want to come to the cushion. I want to be attentive to my life. And there are other times when my practice feels dry, it feels fallow. It's hard to describe, but it's kind of blah. My state of mind feels kind of like the weather these days. There's little color and there's a lot of gray, and there's not a lot of feeling to it. So, in these times, it's harder to stay on the cushion. It's hard to sustain my interest. My mind wanders a lot, looking for something more exciting to engage. I can get restless and dissatisfied, and I'm really not inspired to try to be mindful through the day. So I'm wondering, does anyone else have these times sometimes? It's not that I wish it on you, but I hope so, because that's what I want to talk about today, about how to navigate this place when things feel really dry and uninspired. This isn't depression that I'm describing. If you're feeling depressed, you likely need other kinds of support. This is just a flat mind state. And I've been feeling this way in these past months, and I'm finding it challenging to work with. It's like working in the trenches. It's not the beautiful wows and the aha moments that we sometimes experience on our practice. But what I'm finding is that it's also insightful to work with. In the early years of my practice, when I would run up against these dulled mind states, I'd start asking myself if this practice really worked for me. If I wasn't getting much from it, and if it wasn't juicy, why not just take a break? And so I would stop practicing, maybe for a week or two, maybe sometimes a little bit longer, until inevitably something would happen. I was hurt, or I hurt someone. And as I felt the pain of that, I was drawn back to the cushion as a way to hold the suffering, and I would become re engaged. That was my pattern. Don't feel inspired? Take a break until you are moved to practice again. As I look back, I now think I was kind of a fair weather meditator. And at that point, I didn't have the depth of practice to look a bit more deeply. I'm grateful that that's not so much the case anymore. But the question still remains as to how to navigate these fallow times skillfully and to learn from them. If you were on the daily sit last week, you heard Bill speak about the sound of the frogs in the background in Hawaii, where he and Susan are practicing. Were the frogs getting in the way of a peaceful practice? He said that there will always be things that have the potential to disturb us, and that the practice is not to get rid of the disturbances, but to learn to develop a new relationship with them. He was speaking of things that arise externally, like the sound of the frogs. But I think the answer is as appropriate for the disturbances that arise internally. I've had to find a new relationship to this dry, dull mind state that's been present for me recently. And instead of fighting it, trying to push through it, or even to abandon my practice because of it, I've been trying to meet myself where I am, taking a pause and playing. I mean, really experimenting within my practice in order to change my relationship to this space. So it really starts by creating a holding environment that can support me. When Bill talks about the holding environment, sometimes he uses the image of it being a nest, a place where a baby bird may rest even as it ventures from the nest and then returns. And I imagine that nest as warm and cozy and safe. It's a really good image, and it often works for me. But in these times where I'm feeling really dry and flat and dull, warm and cozy feels way too constrained. I need more spaciousness where I can be with, but not too intimately with my experience. And so I'm learning to create a holding environment that's much more spacious. It's broad and allowing and safe. So I'm trying to think of a good image for it to share with you. And I think of the trails behind my house where I walk into the woods and I feel sheltered among the trees, held there. And then I think of hiking to the top of a mountain. The summit's above tree line and there's a long vista. And there's not as much a feeling of being sheltered as a feeling of spaciousness and allowing and looking over. Both are holding environments that can support us, just depending on what we need in this moment. Sometimes held closely, sometimes held with a little more room to move. So there's space. And secondly, there's the matter of the heart. We want to invite the heart into our holding environment somehow, some way. The heart is really what keeps the practice from feeling mechanical, especially when we're working with such dullness. I used to think that when the heart was engaged, my practice would have kind of a warm and fuzzy feeling to it. And I'm realizing that that's not always the case. It's not always warm and fuzzy, but I think it's always kind and responsive and engaged. So, how to engage my heart? When I'm holding experience that is so clearly painful or so clearly joyful, the heart's easily accessible and it's very responsive. But when I'm dull, it can feel far away and disconnected. Sometimes I can spend almost all of my sit trying to find ways to bring the heart in. I try all the things we talk about: imagery, memories, metaphrases, just focusing my attention on the mid-chest space, gratitude. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. So I've been playing with it and trying to be really creative. I might get off the cushion, maybe take a walk in the woods, slow down, explore and feel connected to nature. And that helps. Or I sometimes listen to beautiful classical music that I know is really evocative for me. And though it might be unconventional, Sometimes I keep the music on really quietly while I meditate, so I can feel my heart begin to move. And even recently, I took the time to read some letters I had saved from my mother, which touched me deeply. Anything that helps me feel and trust my heart's ability to respond. That reassures me and makes it easier to invite my heart into my practice. So my heart can be a bit shy too. I don't know if you have this experience or not, but sometimes if I bring all of my attention directly towards that sense of warmth and openness and try to get close to it, it has a tendency to close up. So again, I have to stay very spacious. It's the way my dog will not look at me in the eye, but looks at me from just the side in her peripheral vision. She can see me, but not straight on. And if I hold my heart in the same way, I notice the openness, allowing it. I get glimmers, and slowly the feeling becomes a little more alive. And that makes all the difference. So, with space and a bit of heart, I can begin to explore this dullened state. Creating my holding environment allows me to be there and to stay there. And actually, it's been pretty insightful. To begin, I've simply tried to label the feeling tone of this state. It's not pleasant, and it's not terribly unpleasant either. So, really, it's mostly neutral, neutral Vedana. And it lets me see how little tolerance I have for neutral states, especially internal neutral states. Part of what's difficult about the neutral feelings is that they're harder to connect with and harder to care about. They just seem boring. And yet, right there is a clue. If I'm engaged, I can say, what does boring feel like? What does dry and fallow feel like? I remember a teacher once saying that Buddhism is not about generalities, but about specifics. So it's not about just saying this is dry, but about asking, what does dry feel like? And then I can feel it in my neck and throat. It's subtle, but it's there. So in asking the question, the dry state becomes more nuanced. It actually becomes slightly unpleasant and slightly more interesting too. It's the holding environment that lets us work with these dull states. And it's taking the time to make the holding environment truly our own, creating an internal environment that supports us, that feels safe, that has the right amount of space and has the heart involved somehow. That's what allows us to stay, just stay. And that's what it takes to meet ourselves where we are. I am wholeheartedly committed to this practice, as I know you are too. Otherwise, you wouldn't show up here each morning. And so, even in these harder times of practice, I now find a way to sit. It's like working in the trenches, but as Susan says, we can do it. I really encourage you to stay with it, to experiment, be unconventional. Ask yourself what works for you. What do I need in this moment? And figure out ways to keep your practice alive. So thank you for your attention. And now let's transition into our time of practice. And I don't even have to say a thing, right? We first bring attention to our bodies and offer them what it is that they might need to relax and to enliven. To create space, right? We need physical space as well as emotional and mental space. So take all the time you need. No need to rush. And as you're ready, find a posture of relative stillness. A posture that is comfortable for you. And maybe with a particularly deep inhale and exhale, let your body begin to settle. Feeling yourself right here. Feeling the weight of your sits bones on your chair. The weight of your shoulders and arms. And hands resting in your lap or on your knees. Your head resting on your spine. And as you bring your attention internally, really linger with noticing what your internal environment is like right now. How can you let your attention be either intimate or spacious in a way that holds all of your experience? And without rushing to get to the meat of your practice, really spend the time to create your holding environment that works for you today. and inviting in a sense of kindness, of responsiveness, spending whatever time's needed to welcome your heart into your practice. Notice the state of your mind in this moment. Is it wandering off a lot? Is there some sense of restlessness in your mind or your body or your heart? And is there something that you need to bring to your practice that allows you just to stay? And be creative to offer that to yourself. softening, receiving your experience just as it is. Thank you all for